3 months ago, I received a letter that changed everything I thought I knew about aging and loneliness. It was from Eleanor, a 74-year-old retired librarian from Minneapolis, who wrote, "I disappeared so slowly that even I didn't notice until I was completely gone." Her letter went on to describe how she'd become a ghost in her own life, invisible not just to her family and friends, but to herself. Eleanor's story isn't unique. Recent research from the National Institute on Aging shows that 35% of adults over 65 report chronic loneliness. But here's the shocking part. Most don't realize they're disappearing until it's almost too late. They think they're just adjusting to retirement or getting used to living alone, when actually, they're following a predictable pattern that leads to complete social isolation. But Eleanor's story has a twist ending that will absolutely blow your mind. And I'm saving it for the very end of this video because it contains the one strategy that can reverse years of isolation in just weeks. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for this. First, let me show you the 7 warning signs that Eleanor missed and that you might be missing right now. Sign number 1. Your stories have no audience anymore. The first sign you're disappearing from life is when you realize your stories have no audience. You used to share your daily experiences, your thoughts about the news, your memories from the past. Now you find yourself starting to tell someone about something interesting that happened, only to stop mid-sentence because you realize nobody's really listening. Or worse, nobody's there to listen at all. This happened to Frank, a 70-year-old former construction foreman from Detroit. Frank had a lifetime of fascinating stories about building skyscrapers, working through blizzards, and the characters he'd met on job sites. But 6 months after his wife passed away, Frank realized he'd been telling these stories to his coffee cup. "I'd start talking about the time we built that hotel in downtown, and then I'd look up and remember there's nobody there who cares," he told me. When your stories lose their audience, something profound happens to your sense of self. Psychologists call this narrative disruption, and it's more dangerous than it sounds. Your life experiences only become meaningful when they're shared and witnessed by others. Without an audience, your memories start to feel less real, your experiences less valuable, and eventually, you start to question whether your life has had any significance at all. The neurological research backs this up. When we tell stories to engaged listeners, our brains release oxytocin and dopamine, chemicals that reinforce memory formation and emotional connection. Without regular storytelling opportunities, these neural pathways begin to weaken, and we literally start to forget who we are. But here's Frank's breakthrough, and it can be yours too. He joined a storytelling group at the local community center, not to perform, but simply to practice having an audience again. Within 3 weeks, Frank was volunteering to mentor young construction workers, sharing his decades of experience with people who genuinely valued his knowledge. Your solution is to identify one person who would genuinely benefit from hearing your stories. It could be a grandchild who's never heard about your early career, a neighbor going through something you've experienced before, or even joining online communities where your experiences are valued. Your stories matter, but they need witnesses to stay alive. Sign number 2. You've started rationing human contact. The second warning sign is when you begin rationing human contact like it's a scarce resource. You used to call friends spontaneously, chat with neighbors regularly, and make plans without overthinking every interaction. Now you find yourself calculating how much social contact you deserve or can afford emotionally, as if reaching out to people depletes some finite reserve. Martha, a 68-year-old former nurse from Portland, described this perfectly. "I started treating conversations like expensive medicine. I'd think, I already talked to my daughter this week. I shouldn't call again." Or, "I saw my neighbor yesterday. I can't bother her today." I was literally prescribing myself loneliness. This rationing behavior stems from a deep fear of being seen as needy or burdensome. After decades of being needed by others, in careers, as parents, as caregivers, Suddenly finding yourself in a position where you might need others feels like a fundamental violation of your identity. So you ration contact to avoid the risk of seeming desperate or clingy. But here's what Martha learned, and what changed everything for her. Most people aren't keeping score of your interactions the way you think they are. That daughter you're worried about calling twice in 1 week, she's probably wondering why you don't call more often. That neighbor you saw yesterday, she enjoyed the conversation and wouldn't mind having another one today. The psychology behind this is fascinating. When we're socially confident, we assume others enjoy our company. But when that confidence erodes, we project our own insecurities onto others, imagining they're as tired of us as we're afraid they might be. This creates a vicious cycle where we withdraw to protect ourselves from rejection that usually isn't even there. Martha's solution was what she called abundance thinking. Instead of rationing contact, she started approaching relationships from a place of generosity rather than scarcity. She began reaching out not because she needed something, but because she had something to offer: a listening ear, a shared experience, a genuine interest in others' lives. The transformation was remarkable. Within a month, Martha wasn't rationing contact anymore. She was scheduling it because her calendar was full of people who wanted to spend time with her. Your solution: challenge yourself to make one extra contact this week. Someone you've been rationing yourself from. Notice how they respond, and use that evidence to calibrate your assumptions about being a burden. Sign number 3. You've become fluent in excuses. The third sign you're disappearing is when you become incredibly creative at making excuses for why you can't participate in life. You used to be someone who found ways to say yes to invitations, activities, and opportunities. Now you're an expert at finding reasons to say no, and these excuses sound so reasonable that even you believe them. Let me tell you about Richard, a 73-year-old retired accountant from Chicago. Richard had an excuse for everything. He couldn't join the book club because his eyes weren't what they used to be. Couldn't attend neighborhood barbecues because of his dietary restrictions. Couldn't volunteer because he wasn't familiar with new technology. Each excuse made perfect sense individually, but together they created an impenetrable wall between Richard and the world. The dangerous thing about excuse fluency is that it feels like problem solving. You're being practical, realistic, responsible. You're not admitting defeat, you're just being sensible about your limitations. But what's really happening is that you're building a case for your own irrelevance, finding evidence that the world has moved on without you and that you don't belong in it anymore. Psychologists have identified this pattern as learned helplessness disguised as wisdom. You start believing that your limitations are more significant than they actually are, and that other people wouldn't want to accommodate them anyway. It's a form of self-protection that becomes self-imprisonment. Richard's turning point came when his granddaughter challenged him directly. She said, "Grandpa, for every reason you can't do something, I can think of 3 ways you could." The question isn't whether you can, it's whether you want to. That hit Richard like a lightning bolt because he realized she was right. The book club excuse. They had large print books and audiobook options. The barbecue. The hosts were happy to accommodate his dietary needs. The volunteering. They had roles that didn't require any technology at all. His excuses weren't protecting him from real barriers. They were protecting him from the vulnerability of trying and possibly failing. Richard's solution was to flip his excuse-making skill into solution finding. For every reason he thought of to avoid something, he challenged himself to find 2 ways he could make it work. This simple mental exercise transformed him from someone who found problems with every opportunity to someone who found opportunities within every problem. Your challenge: identify one thing you've been avoiding and examine whether your reasons are real barriers or protective excuses. Sign number 4. Your comfort zone has become a prison cell. The 4th warning sign is when your comfort zone shrinks so dramatically that it becomes a prison cell disguised as safety. You used to try new restaurants, take different routes to familiar places. strike up conversations with strangers. Now your world has contracted to a few predictable routines, familiar faces, and safe activities that require no risk or adaptation. This is what happened to Dorothy, a 71-year-old former travel agent from Denver, who had planned adventures for thousands of people, but found herself unable to drive to a new grocery store 20 minutes from her house. I kept telling myself I was being sensible, sticking to what I knew worked. She explained, but really, I was so terrified of feeling lost or confused that I'd rather go without groceries than face a new parking lot. The comfort zone prison is particularly insidious because it feels like self-care. You're being kind to yourself, avoiding stress, preventing disappointment. But what you're actually doing is systematically eliminating opportunities for growth, discovery, and the small victories that keep life feeling vibrant and worth living. Neuroscience research shows that when we stop challenging ourselves with novel experiences, our brains begin a process called synaptic pruning, where unused neural pathways literally disappear. This isn't just metaphorical mental stagnation, it's actual brain shrinkage that accelerates cognitive decline. But here's Dorothy's remarkable transformation. She started with what she called micro-adventures, tiny expansions of her comfort zone that felt manageable. She drove one block past her usual turning point. She ordered a different sandwich at her regular deli. She sat in a different pew at church. Each small success built confidence for slightly bigger challenges. Within 3 months, Dorothy had not only mastered that new grocery store, she joined a hiking group and was planning a trip to visit friends in another state. The same brain that had convinced her she needed to stay safe started convincing her that she was capable of more than she'd imagined. The key insight Dorothy shared with me was this: comfort zones aren't fixed. They either expand or contract based on how you treat them. Every time you choose safety over growth, your zone gets smaller. Every time you choose a small challenge over complete safety, it gets bigger. Your micro-adventure: identify one tiny expansion of your comfort zone you could try this week. Something that feels just slightly uncomfortable but not overwhelming. Sign number 5. You've lost track of your own preferences. The 5th sign you're disappearing from life is perhaps the most subtle and heartbreaking. You've lost track of your own preferences. When someone asks what you'd like for dinner, what movie you want to watch, or how you'd prefer to spend your afternoon, you draw a blank. Not because you don't care, but because you've stopped paying attention to what you actually want versus what's easiest or most practical. This happened to George, a 75-year-old widower from Tampa who realized he'd been eating the same 3 meals for 8 months. Not because he enjoyed them, but because they were simple to prepare and didn't require decisions. When his son asked what kind of birthday cake he wanted, George couldn't remember the last time he'd thought about what flavors he actually preferred. Losing track of your preferences is a sign that you've stopped treating yourself as someone worth considering. When life was busier, filled with work demands and family obligations, you might have fantasized about having time to focus on what you wanted. But when that time finally arrives, you discover that the muscle of wanting has atrophied from disuse. This happens because preferences require practice. Every time you choose convenience over preference, efficiency over enjoyment, or what's easy over what you actually want, you send a message to your brain that your desires don't matter. Eventually, your brain stops bothering to generate them. The psychological term for this is learned preference suppression, and it's more common in older adults who've spent decades prioritizing others' needs. The tragic irony is that just when you finally have the freedom to choose what you want, you've forgotten how to want anything. George's recovery started with what he called preference archaeology, deliberately excavating his buried desires by paying attention to tiny moments of attraction or aversion. He noticed he lingered longer in front of certain items at the grocery store. He observed which TV shows made him reach for the remote versus which ones made him settle in. He paid attention to which memories brought smiles versus which ones felt heavy. Slowly, George began making choices based on these subtle signals. He bought the cookies he'd been looking at wistfully. He turned off shows that bored him, even if they were good for him. He called friends whose voices made him feel lighter rather than obligated. Your preference archaeology assignment. Spend one day paying attention to your subtle attractions and aversions. Then make one choice based purely on what you actually prefer, not what's most practical. Sign number 6. You talk about yourself in past tense. The sixth warning sign is when you start talking about yourself primarily in past tense, as if your life story ended with retirement and everything since then is just an epilogue. You introduce yourself by what you used to do, define yourself by roles you used to fill, and reference accomplishments that feel increasingly distant and irrelevant. This shift hit Thomas, a 69-year-old former high school principal from Seattle, like a physical blow when he caught himself at a neighborhood gathering. I realized I'd spent 20 minutes talking about students I taught 15 years ago and hadn't mentioned a single thing about my current life. He told me, it was like I was eulogizing myself while still breathing. Speaking about yourself in past tense is more than nostalgia. It's a form of psychological retirement from your own life. You're essentially declaring that your period of growth, achievement, and relevance is over, and that you're now just managing the decline until the credits roll. This linguistic pattern reflects a deeper belief that your best days are behind you, that your most interesting chapters have already been written, and that whatever time remains isn't worth much attention or investment. It's a form of premature mourning for your own unrealized future. But here's what Thomas discovered. The tense you use to describe yourself shapes how others see you and, more importantly, how you see yourself. When you consistently speak in past tense, you train everyone around you, including yourself, to think of you as someone whose story is essentially over. Thomas made a conscious decision to start speaking about himself in present and future tense. Instead of "I was a principal," he began saying "I'm someone who understands education." Instead of "I used to mentor teachers," he said "I'm passionate about helping people develop their potential." Instead of talking about students he'd influenced years ago, he started talking about community projects he was currently involved in. The change was remarkable. People stopped treating him like a retiree with nothing but memories and started seeing him as someone with ongoing interests and future plans. More importantly, Thomas started seeing himself that way too. Your linguistic experiment for 1 week. Consciously speak about yourself in present tense. Notice how it feels and how others respond differently when you describe yourself as someone who is, rather than someone who was. Sign number 7. You've started living like time doesn't matter. The seventh and most dangerous sign you're disappearing from life is when you start living as if time doesn't matter anymore. Not in a peaceful, Zen-like way, but in a dangerous, drift-through-your-days way, where hours blend into each other without purpose or distinction. You stop wearing a watch, lose track of what day it is, and find yourself thinking, "What's the rush?" about everything. This was the final warning sign that nearly cost Samuel, a 78-year-old retired mechanic from Phoenix, everything he had left. Samuel had started letting days pass without structure, without appointments, without anything that required him to be anywhere at any specific time. "I thought I was finally free from the tyranny of the clock," he said, "but what I'd really done was untethered myself from life itself." When time stops mattering, something profound happens to your brain's reward system. Without deadlines, appointments, or time-sensitive goals, your brain stops producing the chemicals that create motivation and urgency. You enter what researchers call temporal drift, where your life becomes an endless present moment with no forward momentum. This might sound peaceful, but it's actually a form of psychological purgatory. Without the structure that time provides, without the gentle pressure of having somewhere to be or something to accomplish within a time frame, you lose the framework that makes activities feel meaningful and accomplishments feel real. Samuel's wake-up call came when he realized he'd been wearing the same clothes for 4 days. Not because they were dirty, but because changing them felt like an arbitrary decision in a world where nothing had to happen at any particular time. He'd created a life with infinite freedom and zero meaning. The solution wasn't to fill his calendar with meaningless busywork, but to create what he called chosen urgency. Samuel started volunteering at a literacy program that met at specific times, joined a woodworking group with project deadlines, and committed to calling his grandson every Sunday at 3 o'clock. These weren't obligations imposed by others. They were promises to himself that made time matter again. Your Time Matters experiment. Choose one activity this week that has a specific time component, something that requires you to be somewhere at a particular moment or complete something by a certain deadline. Notice how it feels to have time structure your day instead of drifting through it. But here's where Eleanor's story comes in, and why you needed to hear all 7 signs first. Final thought. Remember Eleanor, the librarian who wrote that she disappeared so slowly she didn't notice. Here's what she discovered that changed everything. And this is why I needed you to understand all 7 signs first. Eleanor realized that she hadn't actually disappeared at all. She'd just stopped practicing being visible. Every sign we've discussed today, from losing your audience to living like time doesn't matter, represents a skill that went dormant, not a capacity that was lost forever. Eleanor's breakthrough came when she understood that visibility isn't something that happens to you. It's something you do. She started what she called her visibility practice. Every single day, she did one thing that made her more visible to herself and to others. She told one story to someone who would appreciate it. She made one contact without rationing herself. She said yes to one opportunity instead of finding an excuse. She took one micro step outside her comfort zone. She honored one of her preferences. She spoke about herself in present tense, and she treated time as if it mattered. Within 6 weeks, Eleanor wasn't just visible again. She was more vibrant and connected than she'd been in years. She'd started a reading program at the local elementary school, joined a hiking group, and was dating someone she'd met at the community center. The secret Eleanor discovered is this: you don't recover from disappearing all at once. You practice being visible, one small act at a time, until visibility becomes as natural as breathing again. Your 7 signs aren't a diagnosis, they're a roadmap back to life. You haven't disappeared, you've just forgotten how to be seen. But now you remember. And tomorrow, you practice. If this video helped you recognize yourself, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember they haven't disappeared either. Your comeback story starts now.